The dust never truly settled in Redemption Creek. It hung in the air like memories that refused to fade, coating everything in a fine layer of grit that got into a man's lungs and stayed there. Jack Mercer had grown accustomed to it during his 7 years working the cattle ranch on the outskirts of town, just as he'd grown accustomed to the loneliness that came with choosing solitude over society. His small house sat a mile from the main ranch buildings, close enough to hear the cattle lowing in the evening, but far enough that he could pretend the rest of the world didn't exist. It was a Tuesday evening in late summer when his solitude was shattered by 3 desperate knocks on his weathered wooden door. Jack looked up from the saddle he was oiling, his calloused hands going still. Nobody came out here. The ranch hands knew to leave him be, and the nearest neighbors were the Hendersons, a good 5 miles south. He set down the rag and stood, his boots heavy on the planked floor as he crossed to the door. When he opened it, he found nothing but the amber light of sunset stretching across the prairie. Then he heard it, a small whimper, and looked down. A little girl stood on his porch, no more than 7 years old, with tangled auburn hair that caught the dying light like copper wire. Her dress was torn at the hem and stained with dust and what looked like dried blood. Her feet were bare and bleeding, cut from running across the rough terrain. But it was her eyes that stopped Jack's breath in his chest. They were too old for her face, carrying a weight no child should know. She looked up at him with a mixture of terror and desperate hope that made something crack open inside his carefully guarded heart. "Can you keep me?" she whispered, her voice hoarse and small. The words hung in the air between them like a prayer. Jack stood frozen, his mind racing through 1,000 questions. But the girl swayed on her feet, and he realized she was about to collapse. Without thinking, he reached down and caught her as her knees buckled. She weighed almost nothing in his arms, just bones and fear wrapped in a torn dress. He carried her inside and laid her on his narrow bed, the only bed in the single-room cabin. Her eyes were already closing, exhaustion claiming her before she could protest or explain. Jack stood over her for a long moment, his heart pounding in a way it hadn't since the war. He wasn't a man suited for children. Hell, he wasn't suited for much of anything except hard work and harder silence. He'd come west after the war between the states, after he'd seen enough blood and death to last 10 lifetimes, after he'd lost everything that mattered. The ranch work had saved him in a way, giving him purpose without requiring him to feel too much. And now this broken little thing had appeared on his doorstep, asking him to keep her like she was a lost puppy instead of a human child who deserved so much more than he could offer. He fetched water and clean rags, carefully cleaning the cuts on her feet. She stirred but didn't wake, exhausted beyond consciousness. As he worked, he noticed the bruises. They covered her arms in various shades of yellow and purple, some fresh and some fading. There was a handprint on her upper arm, adult-sized fingers clearly visible in the discoloration. Jack's jaw clenched so tight his teeth ached. He'd seen enough violence in his life to recognize its signature, and rage began to build in his chest like a slow, burning fire. She slept through the night while Jack kept vigil from his chair, his rifle across his knees. He didn't know who might come looking for her, but he knew one thing with absolute certainty. Nobody was taking this child back to whoever had hurt her. Not while he still drew breath. As the hours passed, he found himself studying her face in the moonlight that filtered through his window. Even in sleep, she didn't look peaceful. Her small hands were clenched into fists, and occasionally she would whimper, caught in whatever nightmares chased her even into unconsciousness. Dawn came slowly, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. The girl stirred as light filled the cabin, her eyes opening with a start. For a moment, she looked confused, then frightened. Then she saw Jack sitting in his chair and something like relief crossed her features. He'd made coffee and heated some beans, not knowing what else to do. "You hungry?" he asked, keeping his voice gentle. She nodded, sitting up slowly, wincing as if every movement hurt. He brought her a plate, and she ate like someone who hadn't seen food in days, barely stopping to breathe between bites. When she was done, she set the plate aside and looked at him with those 2 old eyes. "My name is Sarah," she said. "Sarah Mae Pritchard. My daddy drinks. When he drinks, he gets mean. Yesterday he got real mean, and I ran. I ran and ran until I couldn't run anymore, and then I saw your light." She paused, her lower lip trembling. "I don't want to go back there. Please don't make me go back there." Jack felt his heart twist in his chest. He'd spent 7 years trying not to feel anything at all, And now this child was unraveling all his careful defenses with just a few words. "I know your daddy," Jack said quietly. Everyone in Redemption Creek knew Tom Pritchard. He'd been a good man once, before his wife died giving birth to Sarah. The drink had gotten hold of him after that, turning him mean and bitter. Folks whispered about it, but nobody did anything. That was the way of things out here. You minded your own business and expected others to do the same. But this was different. This was a child asking for help, asking to be kept safe. Jack couldn't turn away from that, even if he didn't have the first idea what to do with a little girl. "All right," he said finally. "You can stay here for now, but we need to figure things out proper. There's laws about these things." Sarah's eyes filled with tears and she nodded, relief washing over her face like sunrise. The first few days were harder than any work Jack had ever done. Sarah barely spoke unless spoken to, and she flinched at sudden movements. She followed him around like a shadow, terrified to let him out of her sight. At night, she had nightmares that left her screaming and crying, and Jack would sit on the edge of the bed, unsure how to comfort her but staying there anyway until she fell back asleep. He rode into town and bought her clothes and shoes, ignoring the curious looks from the shopkeeper. He asked Mrs. Henderson to come by and help with things he didn't understand, like fixing Sarah's hair and teaching her to wash properly. Mrs. Henderson was a kind woman in her 50s, worn thin by frontier life but still carrying warmth in her eyes. She took one look at Sarah's bruises and tears filled her eyes. "That poor lamb," she whispered to Jack. "He's been hurting her bad, hasn't he?" Jack nodded grimly. Mrs. Henderson taught him how to braid Sarah's hair, how to mend her dresses, how to talk to a frightened child. She brought over preserves and bread, and she sat with Sarah in the afternoons, just talking quietly about nothing in particular. Slowly, very slowly, some of the terror began to fade from Sarah's eyes. But Jack knew it couldn't last. Sure enough, on the 6th day, Tom Pritchard came riding up to the cabin. Jack was outside chopping wood when he saw the horse approaching, and he recognized Pritchard's slouched form in the saddle immediately. He set down the axe and positioned himself in front of the door, his hand resting on the pistol at his hip. Sarah was inside with Mrs. Henderson, hopefully out of sight. Pritchard pulled his horse to a stop 20 feet away, swaying even in the saddle. He was drunk, had probably been drunk for days. "Where's my girl?" Pritchard slurred, his eyes red, rimmed and mean. "I know you got her, Mercer. Whole town's talking about it. She's my daughter and you got no right to keep her from me." Jack stood his ground, his voice level and cold. "She's safe, Pritchard. That's all you need to know. You ain't getting her back so you can use her as a punching bag when the whiskey talks to you." Pritchard's face turned purple with rage. "You got no right," he shouted, his hand moving toward his own gun. "She's mine. Her mama gave her to me before she died. And I'll do as I please with what's mine." Something dangerous flickered in Jack's eyes, something left over from the war, from a time when he'd been a different kind of man. "You reach for that gun and it'll be the last thing you do," he said quietly. "I've killed men for less than what you've done to that child." Pritchard hesitated, some small part of his whiskey-soaked brain recognizing the truth in Jack's words. This wasn't a man making idle threats. This was a man who'd seen the elephant and come back changed. Pritchard's hand moved away from his gun and he spat on the ground. "The law will hear about this," he growled. "You're kidnapping my child. They'll make you give her back." Jack shook his head slowly. "Then I'll tell the law about the bruises covering her arms and legs. I'll tell them about the handprint on her arm that matches your hand. I'll tell them about how she ran so far her feet bled rather than stay with you one more day. You want to take this to the law, Pritchard, we can do that. But I don't think it'll go the way you think it will." For a long moment, the two men stared at each other. Then Pritchard jerked his horse's reins and rode off, cursing and shouting threats that faded into the prairie wind. Jack watched him go, knowing this wasn't over. Men like Pritchard didn't give up their property easily, and that's how he saw his daughter. As property. As something that belonged to him to do with as he pleased. Jack went inside and found Sarah pressed against the wall, trembling. She'd heard everything. "It's all right," he told her, though he wasn't sure it was. "I won't let him take you." That evening, Jack rode into Redemption Creek to see the sheriff. Ben Morrison was a good man, fair and honest, but he was also bound by the law. He listened as Jack explained the situation, his weathered face growing grimmer with each detail. "I believe you, Mercer," Morrison said when Jack finished. "Hell, everyone in town knows Pritchard's got a mean streak when he's drinking. But the law is the law. He's her father. Unless we can prove in a court that he's unfit, there's not much I can do. Jack leaned forward, his voice intense. So what do? We just send her back to get beaten until she's old enough to run away for good, assuming she lives that long. Morrison rubbed his face tiredly. There might be a way, he said slowly. If you were to apply to become her legal guardian, and if enough people testified about Pritchard's behavior, a judge might grant it. But it'd take time and money for lawyers, and you'd have to prove you could provide for her proper. Jack's mind raced. He had some money saved, enough to hire a lawyer. And he had the ranch job, steady work that paid decent. But could he really do this? Could he really take on the responsibility of raising a child? He thought of Sarah's face, of those two old eyes and that desperate question. Can you keep me? I'll do it, Jack said. Whatever it takes. Morrison nodded, a hint of respect in his eyes. I'll help however I can. I'll start talking to folks, getting statements about Pritchard's drinking and behavior. You get yourself a lawyer. There's a decent one over in Silver Creek, Samuel Matthews. Tell him I sent you. Jack thanked him and rode home under a sky full of stars, feeling the weight of what he'd committed to settling on his shoulders. He'd spent 7 years trying to escape responsibility and connection, and now he was diving headlong into both. The weeks that followed were hard in ways Jack hadn't anticipated. Sarah slowly began to come out of her shell, showing glimpses of the child she might have been if life had been kinder. She laughed sometimes, a sound like bells that made something warm bloom in Jack's chest. She helped him with small chores, feeding the chickens he'd bought and collecting eggs. Mrs. Henderson came by regularly, teaching Sarah to read and do sums. The girl was bright, soaking up knowledge like the parched earth soaking up rain. But the nightmares continued, and sometimes Sarah would retreat into silence for days, lost in whatever dark memories haunted her. Jack learned patience he didn't know he possessed. He learned that sometimes just sitting nearby was enough, that his presence was a comfort even when words failed. He learned how to braid her hair, though his thick fingers made clumsy work of it. He learned her favorite foods and the songs that calmed her. He learned what it meant to put someone else's needs before his own, to worry about another person's happiness more than his own comfort. The lawyer, Samuel Matthews, was a sharp-eyed man in his 40s who listened carefully to Jack's story and agreed to take the case. He warned Jack it wouldn't be easy. Fathers had rights under the law, strong rights, and taking a child away from her natural parent was serious business. But he also said they had a chance, especially with Sheriff Morrison backing them up and willing to gather testimony. The wheels of justice turned slowly, and while they waited for a court date, Jack tried to build a normal life for Sarah. He enrolled her in the schoolhouse in town, riding in with her each morning and picking her up each afternoon. The other children were curious about her at first, then welcoming. Sarah made a friend, a girl named Emma whose family ran the general store. Jack watched Sarah playing with Emma during recess one day, actually playing and smiling, and felt his throat tighten with emotion he'd thought long dead. This was what childhood should look like. This was what he was fighting for. But Tom Pritchard hadn't given up. He continued to drink and rage around town, telling anyone who'd listen that Jack Mercer had stolen his daughter. He tried twice more to come to the cabin, but each time Jack met him with a rifle and cold determination. The second time, Sheriff Morrison came along and warned Pritchard that if he kept harassing Jack, he'd spend some time in a jail cell cooling off. Pritchard left cursing and swearing vengeance, and Jack knew the man's hatred was growing into something dangerous. The court date finally came on a cold October morning. Jack put on his best shirt and jacket, and Sarah wore a new dress Mrs. Henderson had made for her. They rode into Silver Creek together, Sarah's small hand gripping Jack's tightly. The courthouse was a simple wooden building, but it felt imposing and official. Inside, Tom Pritchard sat with his own lawyer, a slick man from back east who'd taken the case for reasons Jack couldn't fathom. Pritchard was sober today, cleaned up and looking almost respectable. Jack felt a chill. This version of Pritchard was more dangerous than the drunk one, because this version could be convincing. The judge was a stern woman named Margaret Cooper, one of the few female judges in the territory. She had a reputation for fairness and for not suffering fools. The hearing began with Pritchard's lawyer arguing that a father's rights were sacred, that Jack was an unmarried man with no experience raising children, that this was a clear case of kidnapping dressed up as charity. He painted Jack as a lonely man who'd stolen another man's child to fill some void in his own life. Then it was Matthew's turn. He called Sheriff Morrison first, who testified about Pritchard's drinking and the complaints he'd received over the years about disturbances at the Pritchard home. He called Mrs. Henderson, who described Sarah's condition when she first saw her, the bruises and the terror in her eyes. He called the doctor who'd examined Sarah and documented her injuries. He called neighbors who testified about hearing screams from the Pritchard house late at night, about seeing Sarah outside in the cold because she was afraid to go inside. Finally, Matthews asked the judge if he could question Sarah. Judge Cooper looked at the little girl for a long moment, then nodded. Sarah walked to the witness chair, looking tiny and frightened in the formal setting. Matthews knelt down beside her, his voice gentle. "Sarah, can you tell the judge why you ran away from your father's house?" Sarah's voice was barely a whisper. "Because he hurt me. He hurt me a lot. When he drinks the whiskey, he forgets I'm his little girl. He says mean things and he hits me. I tried to be good, I tried so hard, but it didn't matter." Tears were streaming down her face now, and Jack had to grip the edge of his chair to keep from going to her. Matthews continued gently. "And when you knocked on Mr. Mercer's door that night, what did you ask him?" Sarah looked across the courtroom at Jack, her eyes locking with his. "I asked him if he could keep me," she said, "because I felt safe with him. I never felt safe before, not since Mama died. But with Mr. Mercer, I feel safe. He's never hit me, not once. He's kind and he takes care of me. He makes me breakfast and helps me with my reading, and he sits with me when I have bad dreams." She paused, then added in a stronger voice, "I want to stay with him. Please let me stay with him." The courtroom was silent. Even Pritchard's lawyer looked uncomfortable. Pritchard himself sat with his head down, whether from shame or anger Jack couldn't tell. Judge Cooper asked Sarah a few more questions, establishing the pattern of abuse, the frequency of Pritchard's drinking, the fear that had driven a 7-year-old child to run barefoot across the prairie in the dark. Finally, she excused Sarah, who ran back to sit beside Jack. He put his arm around her shoulders and felt her lean into him, trusting him to keep her safe. Judge Cooper called a recess to consider her decision. Jack, Sarah, and Mrs. Henderson waited outside on a bench, the autumn sun warm on their faces but unable to chase away the cold knot of fear in Jack's stomach. What if the judge decided blood was thicker than bruises? What if she sent Sarah back to Pritchard? Jack didn't know what he'd do then. Run, maybe. Take Sarah and head west, start over somewhere new where nobody knew them. He'd become an outlaw if that's what it took to keep her safe. After an hour that felt like a year, they were called back inside. Judge Cooper looked at everyone assembled, her face stern and thoughtful. "This is one of the hardest decisions I've had to make," she began. "The law recognizes a father's right to raise his child, and that right is not something I take lightly. However, the law also recognizes that a child's welfare must come first." She looked directly at Pritchard. "Mr. Pritchard, the evidence presented here today paints a picture of a man who has failed in his most basic duty as a father, which is to keep his child safe from harm. Your drinking has turned you into someone your daughter fears, and that fear is justified by the bruises covering her body." She turned to Jack. "Mr. Mercer, you are an unmarried man with no prior experience raising children. Under normal circumstances, I would have serious doubts about placing a young girl in your care. However, these are not normal circumstances. You have shown more concern for Sarah's welfare in a few weeks than her natural father has shown in years. You have put her needs before your own convenience. You have given her safety and stability when she had none." Judge Cooper paused, then continued. "It is the decision of this court that Tom Pritchard is an unfit father, and that custody of Sarah May Pritchard is hereby granted to Jack Mercer, on the condition that Mrs. Henderson will serve as a female guardian, and that Mr. Mercer will ensure Sarah receives proper schooling and upbringing. Mr. Pritchard, you are forbidden from having any contact with Sarah until such time as this court determines you have addressed your drinking and can demonstrate you are no longer a danger to your daughter." The courtroom erupted. Pritchard surged to his feet, shouting, but Sheriff Morrison was there to restrain him. Matthews was shaking Jack's hand, grinning. Mrs. Henderson was crying and hugging Sarah. Jack sat frozen for a moment, unable to quite believe it was real. Then Sarah threw herself into his arms, sobbing with relief, and it became real. She was his now. This frightened, broken little girl was his responsibility, his to protect and raise and help heal. The weight of it was enormous, but for the first time in 7 years, Jack felt something other than emptiness. He felt purpose, he felt needed. He felt impossibly something like hope. They rode home that evening as the sun was setting, painting the prairie in shades of gold and crimson. Sarah sat in front of Jack on his horse, safe within the circle of his arms. She was quieter than he'd expected, processing everything that had happened. Finally, she spoke, her voice small but clear. "Mr. Mercer, are you really going to keep me? Forever?" Jack tightened his arms around her gently. "Yes, Sarah. I'm going to keep you. For as long as you need me. For as long as you want to stay. You're home now. You're safe." Sarah was quiet for another moment, then she asked, "Can I call you Papa?" The question hit Jack like a physical blow. He'd lost everything once in the war and its aftermath. He'd lost his family, his home, his faith in anything good. He'd come west to disappear, to become nobody, to feel nothing, and now this child was asking if she could call him Papa, was offering him a role he'd never expected to have, a connection he'd spent years running from. His voice was rough when he answered, "I'd be honored if you called me that, Sarah." The months that followed transformed both of them. Jack discovered reserves of patience and gentleness he didn't know he possessed. He learned to navigate the complicated world of raising a daughter, from dealing with scraped knees to understanding the complex social dynamics of schoolgirls. Mrs. Henderson was invaluable, teaching him what he needed to know and providing Sarah with a maternal presence she desperately needed. The community of Redemption Creek, initially suspicious of the unusual arrangement, gradually accepted and even embraced them. The sight of the gruff cowboy braiding his daughter's hair before school became common, and people smiled at the gentleness in his hands as he worked. Sarah bloomed like a flower finally given water and sunlight. The nightmares became less frequent. The fear in her eyes faded, replaced by the natural sparkle of childhood. She grew taller and stronger, her laughter ringing through the cabin more and more often. She excelled in school, devouring every book she could get her hands on. She made friends and played and did all the things children should do. The bruises healed, though Jack knew the emotional scars would take longer. On bad days, when memories overwhelmed her, he was there. Always there, solid and steady as the prairie itself. Tom Pritchard, for his part, seemed to fade into the bottle completely after losing custody. He was seen less and less in town, and when he was seen, he was always drunk. Some people pitied him. Jack didn't. He'd seen too many men use their pain as an excuse to hurt others. Pritchard had made his choices and Sarah had paid the price. The only thing Jack felt when he thought about Pritchard was a cold satisfaction that the man would never hurt Sarah again. One evening about a year after the court decision, Jack and Sarah sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant shades of orange and purple. Sarah was working on her schoolwork, her tongue poking out slightly in concentration as she practiced her letters. Jack was mending a bridle, but mostly he was just watching her, marveling at how much she'd changed. The terrified, broken child who'd knocked on his door was gone, replaced by a bright, curious girl who smiled easily and dreamed big dreams about the future. "Papa," Sarah said suddenly, looking up from her slate. "Yes, sweetheart," Jack replied. Sarah hesitated, then asked, "Do you ever regret it? Keeping me, I mean. You were happy before. Living alone. Now you have to take care of me and worry about me and everything." Jack set down the bridle and looked at her seriously. "Sarah, before you came, I wasn't happy. I was just existing, going through the motions. You didn't interrupt my happiness. You gave it to me. Every single day with you is a gift I never expected to receive." Sarah's eyes filled with tears, but she was smiling. "I love you, Papa," she whispered. Jack pulled her into a hug, his own eyes stinging. "I love you too, Sarah. More than I ever thought I could love anyone." They sat there as the sun set, wrapped in each other's arms, and Jack thought about that desperate question she'd asked over a year ago. "Can you keep me?" At the time, he'd thought she was asking for his help. Now he understood she'd been offering him salvation. As the years passed, Sarah continued to thrive. She became a young woman of remarkable character, shaped by the hardships she'd endured but not defined by them. She had Jack's strength and determination, combined with a compassion that came from knowing suffering firsthand. She helped other children in town who were struggling, always the first to offer kindness to someone who needed it. She never forgot where she'd come from or what Jack had done for her. When Sarah turned 16, she won a scholarship to attend a teaching college back east. It was an incredible opportunity, a chance to get an education and make something of herself. But she was torn about leaving Jack. He'd given up everything for her, and the thought of leaving him alone again broke her heart. They talked about it for weeks, sitting on that same porch where they'd had so many conversations over the years. "You have to go," Jack finally told her. "This is your chance to see the world, to become the person you're meant to be." "I'll be fine here, Sarah. I was alone before and I survived it." Sarah shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "But I don't want you to just survive, Papa. You taught me that life should be more than just surviving." Jack smiled and wiped her tears away. "Then I won't just survive, I'll live. I'll think about you every day and be proud of everything you accomplish. And when you come home to visit, you can tell me all about your adventures." Sarah went east that fall, and Jack did exactly what he promised. He lived. He threw himself into his work at the ranch, eventually becoming foreman. He stayed involved in the community, helping other children who needed it, inspired by Sarah's example. He wrote to Sarah every week, long letters full of news from home and words of encouragement. She wrote back just as often, telling him about her studies, her new friends, the amazing things she was learning. 3 years later, Sarah came home with her teaching certificate and a young man named David who looked at her like she hung the moon. Jack liked him immediately. David was kind and respectful, with calloused hands that showed he wasn't afraid of hard work. More importantly, he clearly adored Sarah and treated her with the gentleness she deserved. They were married that spring in a simple ceremony in Redemption Creek, with the whole town turning out to celebrate. Sarah and David built a house just a mile down the road from Jack's cabin. Sarah got a job teaching at the schoolhouse where she'd once been a student. David found work at the ranch alongside Jack. They had children, 3 of them, and Jack was Papa Jack to them all, teaching them to ride and rope, telling them stories, loving them fiercely. His cabin, once a place of solitude and silence, became filled with the sounds of grandchildren laughing and playing. On quiet evenings, Jack would sit on his porch and marvel at the life he'd built from that single moment of choice. He'd been a broken man, hollowed out by war and loss, content to exist in the shadows. Then a terrified child had knocked on his door and asked if he could keep her, and everything had changed. She'd given him purpose when he had none, love when he thought himself incapable of it, family when he'd resigned himself to being forever alone. Years later, when Jack was an old man with silver in his hair and lines carved deep in his face, Sarah came to visit him one evening. Her own children were grown now, making their own way in the world. She sat beside him on the porch, the same porch where they'd shared so many conversations over the decades. "Papa," she said quietly, "I've been thinking about that night I came to your door. I was so scared. I didn't know if you'd help me or send me away. I just knew I couldn't go back to my father's house." Jack took her hand, his own gnarled and weathered from a lifetime of hard work. "I've been thinking about that night too," he said. "I've thought about it 1,000 times over the years." Sarah smiled. "You saved my life that night, Pa. You gave me everything." Jack shook his head gently. "No, Sarah, you saved mine. I was the one who was lost. You were the one who found me." They sat in comfortable silence as the sun set over the prairie, painting the sky in those same brilliant colors that had marked so many evenings of their life together. The dust still hung in the air, as it always had, but it didn't feel like a burden anymore. It was just part of the landscape, part of home. Sarah leaned her head on Jack's shoulder, and he put his arm around her, just as he had that first night when she'd run back to him in the courtroom. She'd asked if he could keep her, and he had. He'd kept her safe, kept her loved, kept her whole, and in doing so, she'd kept him from disappearing into the emptiness he'd been courting for so long. The prairie wind blew gently across the land, carrying with it the sounds of cattle and the distant laughter of children playing. Jack closed his eyes and smiled, grateful beyond measure for the knock on his door that had changed everything, for the small voice that had asked the question that became his salvation, for the child who'd grown into the woman beside him, for the family that had grown from a single act of courage on both their parts. He'd learned that sometimes the people we save end up saving us, that sometimes redemption comes in the smallest packages, and that sometimes the most important thing we can say is simply yes when someone asks if we can keep them. As darkness fell over Redemption Creek, Jack and Sarah sat together on that old porch, surrounded by the life they'd built from ashes and choices and love. It hadn't been easy. There had been hard days and painful memories and moments when the weight of it all seemed too much to bear. But they'd faced it together, this unlikely father and daughter bound not by blood but by something stronger, something forged in desperation and tempered by time into something unbreakable. They'd both been lost once, broken by circumstances beyond their control. But they'd found each other in the darkness, and together they'd found their way home.